Well, good evening, everybody. How are you? Y'all are looking all right? You look like you need a little campfire time. I know I do. It helps. Well, come on, get you something to drink. Get your mug filled to the top and get settled in here. Now, you can tell a story if you like, but if you're not ready, I've got a story I'd like to tell you. It's a pretty good one. Heard it not too long ago, and in fact, what it is I've got it here in text, and I'm going to read it to you. And it's better that way because I can't remember all the details, and it's best you hear all the details. This one here is called The Bear Trap. You ever seen a bear trap? They're huge. Anyway, this one's called The Bear Trap. Well, when he saw that the bear trap was gone from the shed where he kept the furs and the gear, LaCroix knew they intended to kill him. Previously, he had thought they would try to rob him and then leave. After all, one of them was his nephew, the son of his sister, who had gone long ago to the city. The son of that sister, yes, LaCroix grinned wryly. Maybe it was not so unusual. Still, he had not expected it, and they had taken the bear trap. That affronted him. In the world of nature where LaCroix had grown old, it was only natural for the young to kill the old. That they should select the bear trap, though, well, that was an affront. Even when you trap the bear, you take him quickly. You do not leave him in the forest chained for smaller mouths to gnaw on before he's dead. They had talked of the traps, and especially the bear trap, and then they'd taken the trap and they set it for him, for his own death. LaCroix was positive now that he saw the trap was missing, and it made him angry. When they first arrived, LaCroix was pleased. He did not have much company out here. The chipmunks that dwelt in his fireplace came forth in the evening to barter with him for cherry pits, and the long-tailed deer mouse sometimes came very close along the rafters when he was lying motionless in his bunk. But the chipmunks were absent. They were sleeping during the whole time of the big cold, and the deer mouse came only intermittently, being occupied at intervals with problems of maternity. The big wild, the foxes, the coyotes, the deers, the bears, they were not tinged with any quality of friendship. They shared the wilderness with him as neighbors share the city. When he heard the sound of the airplane, he thought at first it might be a party of fishermen directed to him by the ranger. The ranger was the only man he saw with any regularity, and like the chipmunks, the ranger did not show himself in the time of the big cold. As the aircraft with the belly of a boat came over the piney hills and slanted down that late June sunshine to his lake, LaCroix hastened from his cabin down to the wharf. It was the aircraft that regularly brought him fishermen and later returned them, and there was always fishing tackle with the luggage on the wharf. But the two men were not fishermen. One was LaCroix's nephew, and the other was the man his nephew called Al, a soft-spoken man with hard-looking eyes who spoke to the nephew as you speak to a backward child or a forward dog. This man wore a black straw hat with a white band, and he did not take off that hat until he went to bed. They had not brought any food with them. LaCroix made griddle cakes and syrup from melted brown sugar, and he fried thick slices of side pork. But neither his nephew nor the man called Al ate very much. In the morning, we will catch some eating fish, LaCroix said apologetically. We'll take the boat. We'll go up the far end of the lake where the big lake fish like it in the cold water. No, the man called Al said. You go. LaCroix was puzzled. His nephew said, well, what Al means, we ain't so experienced in that kind of fishing. We like the kind in the river. But the tackle, LaCroix said, you have brought lake tackle, even the trolling gear. So you take the tackle, Al said. LaCroix did not know what to say to them. They sat around the table LaCroix had made from slabs of logs, polished smoothly. The man called Al looked about the room with the furs hanging on its walls, the slender ermine, the big round blankets of prime beaver, and a deep pile of winter fox. He looked at it as though he was memorizing it. Worth a lot of dough, he said finally. Don't you sell them? Only sometimes, a skin or two, LaCroix said, to a fisherman who wants a gift to take home. I don't need the money. They misunderstood him. LaCroix's nephew said eagerly to Al, "See, Uncle doesn't need money. There's gold in the streams when he needs money. All these years he takes the gold he needs from the streams and he keeps the furs for himself." Al looked at him, his eyes suddenly bright. "Been taking the gold a long time, eh? Saving it up for something?" "All right," LaCroix thought. "Let it be that way." "Well, it is not difficult," he said. "All you need is a frying pan and 20 or 30 years. They left it then, but LaCroix had the beginnings of knowledge. When he took the pail and he went down the path to the spring, they would confer. Well, let them confer. They could not force him to tell them of the gold. Even at his age, he was more man than the two of them put together. They could not kill him either, for if he were dead, he could not tell them where to find the gold. Well, he went back into the house with the water, and they were sitting, as before, in the chairs made of antlers, tied cleverly together with thongs of leather. But LaCroix noticed, without appearing to notice, that the hammer of the carbine on the mantel was drawn back to full cock. So they had taken it down and levered the shells out of it and put it back. You see? Well, they felt better now, his nephew and Al. LaCroix felt all right, too. He was pleased to have someone to talk to and wished to make the most of it because he might not have him for long. He felt also a rising excitement. To match wits with the beast was one thing, but not wholly fair. For any hunter, the best game of all is man himself. So LaCroix built the fire up as the coolness rose from the surface of the lake, and he stirred the wild honey thickly into his coffee. And he told him stories of the gold and the furs and the traps. He told of the nugget as big as his fist, which he had found in the riffle ahead of a trout pool, and of the bear whose 7-foot-long pelt was stretched in front of the hearth. This was the bear that had carried the trap a day and a night's journey before LaCroix caught up with him. "Well, couldn't he get out?" asked LaCroix's nephew. "Not from a good catch above the point," LaCroix said. "Not a bear nor a man either. 8 pounds the trap in the chain, not counting the drag log. My own drag log is oak," LaCroix said, "and is weighted with 40 pounds of metal." "A man couldn't carry that very far," the man called Al said. "Nor a bear usually," LaCroix said, "though it is not the weight that bothers the bear. The log catches in the brush and between trees and holds him unless he can tear it loose." "I didn't know you could tear it loose," nephew said. "If you are fortunate, the trap will take the bone," LaCroix said. "Sometimes a bear that is very strong and very determined will then tear his own flesh until he's free." The nephew looked a little pale, LaCroix noted. Al did not look any different. LaCroix said, "Once I knew a man of the Chippewa Nation who was caught just above the ankle in a bear trap. Even though the bone was not broken cleanly, he tied his belt around the leg to stifle the bleeding. He cut himself free with his knife." Now LaCroix's nephew was paler. "The Chippewa were very brave," LaCroix said, "also very practical. If he had not cut himself free, in 2 days' time the foot would have gone bad, and without water he would fail up in the head. Then the insects would crawl all over him, and soon, with the smell of bad meat in the air, the little ones would come." Afterwards, he added an explanation. He said, "Those with the sharp teeth. Yeah, that's why it's better to be brave early." The man, Al, and LaCroix's nephew did not have much to say to that. Well, so LaCroix showed him where to sleep and went to bed himself. Well, in the morning, he left them sleeping in the cabin and took the boat up the lake. It occurred to him that he might just keep going. They would probably starve before the ranger or the man with the aircraft found them. But a nephew constitutes family, and LaCroix had no other family except for his sister. So before noon, he was back in the cabin with 4 jackfish, big pike with white meat that flaked off, sweet and boneless. Have you eaten pike? He washed the fish carefully, then cleaned them and wrapped them in moss. No one else was in the cabin. LaCroix looked in the bedroom and in the kitchen, and he went to the shed where he kept the traps and extra furs. It was then he saw that the bear trap was missing, and after that he was angry. He went through the cabin quickly, but they had not missed anything, his nephew and Al. No ammunition, no weapons, nothing was left. LaCroix went out of the cabin and he took the high trail through the spruce. A mile up on the shoulder of the very first hill, the country that was his country, in the way that a city man's yard is his country, was spread out around him. There was the lake, rising in the marsh where the springs opened gaping holes in the earth faults and poured the torrents of icy water out. The lake itself, piling up in deep cold water where the hills held it, except for the notch where that long plume of spray marked the outlet that became the river. Then there was the river itself, looping out and back on itself in an enormous horseshoe, with a wide stretch of blackberry bushes inside the horseshoe, just like a waving green sea, growing thickly on the ground of an old burn where forest fire had been stopped by the river. Out below the shoulder of the hill, several rivulets converged and made a stream that flowed between steep banks to join the river. It was a small stream now in late June, but in the time of melting snows, it ran bank full of angry water, deeper than a man is tall, and no man could stand against it. From the high path, LaCroix could see all this, and beyond the berry grounds to the place where the river came back on itself and where he kept that canoe. It was safe there beneath the rapids, and when he returned from the settlement, it was quicker and easier just to beach the canoe there and walk the mile to his cabin, across the berry grounds and the ravine and the shoulder of the hill, than it was to pole a canoe against that whitewater. Well, while he watched, the men who were his nephew and the man called Al came from the place of the canoe, walking slowly and wearily, so LaCroix thought. It was a long walk and a heavy burden. The anger was now welling up in him. He was not angry often. When you're a member of the wild community, you do not set up the rules. You let the others who share the wild community show you their rules, and you play thus. The rules differ. For the chipmunks, there's one rule: the small sociable dealers in cherry pits and peach stones and tomato seeds. For the deer mice, there's another, very similar. For the wolf, there's still another, and this one is pitiless and without quarter. But there's justice to it, and honor. And now there was a rule for men. Their rule. Just so, LaCroix thought. Thus it shall be. He went back to the cabin and built a huge cooking fire. The chimney became so hot that the chipmunks came out of the chinks to sit panting indignantly on the high stone and chatter at him. By the time his nephew and the other man arrived, LaCroix had one of the big pike split and broiling on a plank, potatoes roasting, and a blackberry pie baking in the reflector oven. Ooh, he loved my blackberry pie. Also, he appeared to be very jovial, even if he didn't feel that way. But he didn't want the two younger men to know he was suspicious of him. His nephew and Al were not jovial. They were wearing the brand new clothes they'd brought with them, the flannel shirts and the rubber-lined duck pants, and man, they had sweated those shirts dark color. You're not in condition, LaCroix said. If you took such a walk every morning, you'd soon be in condition. If I took such a walk every morning, the man called Al said bitterly, I'd be dead tomorrow. You must not worry, LaCroix said. Maybe you will be dead tomorrow anyway. Al stopped with a forkful of pie halfway to his mouth. What do you mean by that? His eyes were hard and they were cold. He don't mean nothing, the nephew said. Just gabbing, ain't you, Uncle? No, LaCroix said. I don't like this, Al said. I don't like none of this. He reached into his hip pocket of his brand new pants and took out a small, evil-looking pistol. So maybe I'll be nice, LaCroix said with a huge laugh. How would you like to know where the gold is? Now we're getting somewhere, Al said. Maybe you would like instead to know the way strychnine tastes when mixed with blackberries. The man pointed the little gun straight at LaCroix's belt buckle. Don't shoot him yet, LaCroix's nephew said. Then we'll never know. On the other hand, LaCroix said, if you knew the answers to both those questions, you would not be any farther ahead than you are now. So learning's not everything, eh? He walked from the table to the fireplace and poked up the ashes. The gun in Al's hand followed him. The hell with this, Al said suddenly. I'm going to shoot him now, and then we'll take the place apart and find the gold." "Yes," LaCroix's nephew said, "and then the ranger will come and find the old man with a bullet in him, and the gold will not take us far enough so we can spend any of it." For a moment, the hard eyes of the man called Al shifted to the younger man. LaCroix bent casually over the fire with a skillet, and as Al looked back towards him, he tossed that skillet of red-hot embers full into Al's face, and in the same turning motion went right out the door. That little gun spoke sharply as he went, and he felt the pain in his arm. It was not much of a pain. The little gun did not amount to much, in LaCroix's opinion. It was a gun to shoot people in bed with. Well, he ran through the clearing, waiting for the gun to speak again, but it did not. The hot ashes had done their work well. He reached the edge of the new forest and dropped down onto the river trail, for he heard, from the shouting, that they were outside of the cabin. It would be too bad, he thought, if the cabin should burn, but the floor was stone, so there was not much chance of that. LaCroix went very quickly along the trail. He did not know exactly what he would do, except that he was not going to run away. There was a kind of a challenge to it, and he had the two feelings full and strong in him now, both anger and excitement. Most of the advantages he had in the beginning were now gone, but now there was room for achievement. Once he stopped in the shade to look at his arm, he was surprised at the blood. It had soaked his shirt clear to the cuff, and his hand was red. When he lifted his arm, it did not go very high. He was astonished. The pain was there, of course, but the pain was always there with a wound. The LaCroix tore off the sleeve and bandaged the wound. When he had a moment, he'd take his knife and dig the bullet out. It was not good for a bullet to stay in the flesh, and although it was not so serious a thing as it once was. He had come a half-mile from the cabin. Occasionally he heard shouts, but they did not yet know which way he'd gone. Off the trail, he lay for a moment in the tall growth beside the river. He was upstream from the big pool where the river was forced into the first curve of the horseshoe, and the force of it ground out a sweeping riffle. It was almost a rapids. The LaCroix was upstream from the riffle, but the winds blew easily toward him from it. He could not see because of the bend in the river. His nose wrinkled at a scent. He put his nose close to the water, let the breath go out of him, and all empty and relaxed, he let the river speak to him, and the wind bring him its sounds. While he was there listening, the no-see-ums made a cloud around his head. Now, some people have said the tiny flies could drive you mad. LaCroix did not pay any attention to them. They're just like silence and pain and death. When you cannot avoid, you endure. Presently, he was sure of what he had heard and he had smelled. He left the river and, keeping in the growth of the young forest, angled toward the watercourse in the ravine. The breeze was very light now, but LaCroix was careful to keep it on the side of his face, even in this heavy cover. Finally, he came to the ravine, and he risked showing himself long enough to roll easily over the edge, landing on his feet in a few inches of water and not falling because he had expected it that way. The banks were very steep, higher than a man's head. He stayed in that trickle of water, walking safely upright. At the beginning of the spruce, he left that ravine. He was at the head of a little burned-out plateau where the blackberry bushes made their smooth and shallow jungle. LaCroix kept low and moved quietly along the game trails. Occasionally he paused to listen and munched on the big purplish berries that were almost like flesh. They were ripening early this year. There was no fresh deer sign, and only an occasional hare in full summer brown coat lifted big ears to look at him. He did not hear the voices anymore. Doubtless they were searching along the lake, thinking he had gone the shortest distance to escape. Escape, LaCroix thought. It depends on who is the hunter and who is the hunted. Halfway through the berry ground, the breeze again moved, and LaCroix's nose wrinkled. A moment later, he saw the bear cub. The size of a bulky little dog, but more like a child than a dog, it sat on its haunches before the blackberry bush and held a cane with a paw while it licked the berries expertly, like a man eating a sparse ear of corn. The cub saw LaCroix and let out a startled woof. The cub's big ears come into attention. LaCroix crouched very still, wondering how far that woof carried in the gentle wind. But nothing happened, and after a while the bear cub went back to the berry canes. LaCroix picked a few berries too. The cub looked at him again, running his slim tongue out and up and over the end of his nose. But he did not snort again, and soon LaCroix and the cub picked berries together. Then LaCroix began moving toward the river. Not toward the loop where the ravine came out and pooled shallows lay, but across the horseshoe toward the place where his canoe was beached. Well, the little bear swung his ears up again to watch him. LaCroix put a handful of berries on the trail and moved away. Presently, the cub followed, sniffing. The cub did not like the smell on the berries, but they tasted fine. Well, he moved along cautiously after LaCroix, ears up, tongue out, moving with the rump-high, awkward, smooth bear gait. LaCroix stopped and picked more berries. The little bear waited, openly hopeful. LaCroix moved more towards the river, leaving the berries. The little bear followed. LaCroix chuckled to himself. "It is a payment in advance I make to you," LaCroix said softly, "for what may occur between us later." LaCroix and the cub were quite close together when he spotted the two men at last. They were on the high trail where he had been in the morning, but standing clear against the sky. Hunters of men, LaCroix snorted in disgust. If only he had a carbine, but he did not. He didn't have anything but a sore arm and a history of many encounters in which death had stood very close to him. Now he rose, and the men on the ridge looked his direction, and he moved deliberately so that his red shirt flared in the late sun among the greens and browns of the berry patch. One of them shouted, and when LaCroix was sure they saw him, he ducked down beneath the chest-high bushes once again. He could still see them, running downhill from the high trail, one man cutting straight toward him across the bend of the river, and the other going wider to cut him off from the forest. Hunters of men, LaCroix scoffed again in disgust. But this was not a time for criticism. The first man was committed to the flatland now. He was running toward the ravine. In a little while he was between LaCroix and the pool, and the ravine was in between. LaCroix put his right hand on his left arm, which was very stiff now, and looked at the little bear. The cub was sitting up, ears high and mouthful of blackberries, observing. LaCroix said, "Sorry, little bear," and kicked it hard on the rump. The little bear squalled and scrambled away towards the bushes. LaCroix lay very still under the berry bushes. He could hear the receding sound of the cub in flight. He could hear more distantly the sound of men running and their shouts. And then suddenly he could hear the sound of great rage. A water-splashing, boulder-spewing, turf-tearing rage. He stood up now and chuckled. It no longer mattered if the men saw him. He could see the cub humping toward the ravine and the pool beyond. And the man called Al was standing right in the little bear's path. And behind the man, with great rage itself, was Mother. The mama bear came erupting out of the river and paused only an instant with her 4 feet close together, in a movement of bears that is best called a kind of a clumsy, deadly grace. Then her head swung from side to side until her nose and her ears located the general area of her wrath and focused it into a burning pinpoint of rage that left no room for wisdom, caution, or fear, but only the rage brought critically down on the man between her and her cub that had been hurt. LaCroix watched intently. Old, he thought, and big, perhaps 450 pounds. He was curious. It's really very rare to see a bear charge a man. There was a beauty and a grace to it. She came on through the brush, and the brush was mowed in a path, and the man called Al ran and stood at last on the edge of the ravine, and he was shooting at her with his little gun, but it did not make any difference. She came on, and at the last moment, the man called Al turned and tried to jump the ravine, but in midair the bear reached for him, and without pause, engulfed him in the air, and they fell together into the ravine. LaCroix let out his breath slowly. It had happened all within the space of time in which he could hold his breath. Then he heard his nephew shouting. His nephew had crossed the ravine further up and was running wildly, blindly now, through the tearing edges of the blackberries, his face very white, his mouth wide with terror. "Run!" LaCroix shouted. "There's a bear behind you." The running man fell and cried out. When he rose again, he was bleeding from the blackberry thorns. But that was not what made him cry out. He had seen the mama bear, and now he thought it came after him. LaCroix moved back the little space between himself and the river where the canoe was beached. He moved very carefully now. They'd picked a very good place to set the bear trap for him. Where they had placed it, a man could not approach the canoe to turn it over, not to slide it into the water, without stepping where the trap was concealed. Yeah, concealed, LaCroix thought. Hunters of men, indeed. They'd covered it with long grass, pulling up the grass to put down on the jaws and the pan of the trap. And after a full day in the hot sun, the dead grass had withered in a pattern that outlined the trap as clearly as a sign on a post. His face wry with disgust and the anger up in him again, LaCroix walked into the river and came to the beach from the waterside, turning the canoe with his good arm and pulling it from the slick mud slide into the shallows. He held the canoe awkwardly while he sat down in the stern. He then swung his legs inboard safely. He unlashed the paddle, and bracing it against the bottom like a pole, he backed the canoe offshore. "Wait, Uncle!" his nephew cried out frantically from the edge of the berry patch. "Wait for me!" LaCroix backed the canoe a little further, waiting. The younger man tore loose from the last of the thorns and, stumbling with fright and exhaustion, plunged toward the beach. "Wait!" he gasped. LaCroix pulled the canoe into a new position, a position carefully selected. His nephew's face went slack with a great relief. He slid down the incline to the beach, hands reaching outward for the canoe. His foot caught on a root. He slipped again on the smooth, glassy mud and fell forward, his hands outstretched, squarely into the patch of drying grass. The jaws of the great trap struck upward out of the grass like a live thing and caught him by two arms, just below the elbows. He screamed. "So," LaCroix said from the canoe 6 feet away, "well, you found my missing bear trap. Thank you. Unfortunately for you, the device to open it has been long lost, longer than the trap." His nephew lay in the strange sprawled position. It appeared that he was clinging tightly to the trap, his hands and his arms dangling limply. "It is possible for two men with a log to open such a trap without the device," LaCroix said, "but not when one of them is caught in it and the other one has but one useful arm." His nephew whimpered. "It is good to be quiet, very quiet," LaCroix said. "If you are very quiet, perhaps the bear will not hear you." "I do not want to hurt you," the nephew said. "It was the money. All my life I have heard of how you lived out here alone with all this gold." "Of course," LaCroix said and chuckled. "And now I leave you with all my gold. Remember when I told you about that drag log on the trap? It is weighted with 40 pounds of metal, as I told you. 40 pounds of pure gold. You may have it until I return, the gold and the trap. You aren't going to leave me here?" There was a new terror on the young man's face. "I have no choice," LaCroix said. "You see, I am a tender-hearted man, my dear nephew. I cannot get you out of this trap, and I cannot sit here and watch you die slowly by the edge of the river." "Don't leave me," the younger man sobbed. "Furthermore, there are regulations," LaCroix said. "It is required to report all hunting accidents, such as men shooting at bears with little pistols. The rangers are very strict." "Please," the nephew cried, "I do not want the gold." "It is good for you to say so," LaCroix said, "but I can see that you are very much attached to it just now." He paused. "I will be back the day after tomorrow," LaCroix said, or perhaps the next day. "It'll be difficult to reach the settlement quickly with only one good arm. But meanwhile, you will learn some new stories to tell me of men caught in bear traps." He lifted the paddle. "No!" the young man screamed. "Yes," LaCroix chuckled to himself as he stroked with the paddle and the canoe shot out into the current. Behind him, the young man was suddenly very quiet. Well, there's a story for you, folks. I hope you had a good time with that one. It might teach us a lesson. Gosh, there's a few lessons in there, isn't there? Well, I'm glad you came around for that story, and we'll I'll be looking forward for one or two of you to tell a story like that. Next time we get together, let's all try to have a story. I know I will. Well, until then, this is Clay Steele. Be good humans. Good night.